The envelope was small, harmless looking, just another piece of mail slipped under her office door. But inside it carried a message that would change Amara Johnson's life forever. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the letter. No signature, no return address, just 7 words typed in bold, black ink. Go back where you came from. She froze. The room seemed to shrink around her. Those words weren't just hateful. They were personal, targeted, aimed like a weapon at her very identity. For a moment, Amara couldn't breathe. She was a young attorney, 24 years old, fresh out of law school, with dreams bigger than the cramped office where she worked. She had fought her way into this career, determined to use her knowledge to protect people who didn't have a voice. But now, this single sheet of paper felt heavier than all the legal books stacked on her shelves. She dropped into her chair, staring at the words again and again. She thought of her mother, who had worked multiple jobs just to get her through school. She thought of her grandmother, who had told her stories about marching for civil rights decades earlier. And now, someone was telling her she didn't belong, that she should leave. Amara wanted to crumple the letter, throw it in the trash, forget it ever existed. But something inside her refused. Something deep, fiery, unshakable. Because while those words were meant to silence her, Amara was about to make sure they sparked her loudest fight yet. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every family denied a home because of their skin color, every worker overlooked because of their accent, every child told they weren't good enough. And as she folded the letter and placed it carefully inside a file marked evidence, she made a promise to herself. This letter would not be her defeat. This letter would be her beginning. That single note of hate would lead Amara into the biggest courtroom battle of her life. A battle where she'd stand face to face with millionaires, powerful lawyers, and a system designed to keep people like her out. What none of them knew was that the very words meant to break her would instead give birth to her greatest triumph. And this is her story. Amara sat alone in her tiny office that night, the glow of her desk lamp stretching shadows across the walls. The letter lay flat on her desk, its message burning into her memory. She had read it so many times she could almost see the words imprinted in her mind, seared there like a scar. Go back where you came from. It was a phrase she had heard in whispers before, muttered under someone's breath, hidden in the sting of casual conversations. But never this direct, never this deliberate. Her first instinct was fear. Fear that someone had been watching her. Fear that this was just a beginning, that next time, it wouldn't be words typed on paper, but something worse. She checked the locks twice before leaving the office that evening, her heart racing with each step toward the parking lot. But fear wasn't new to Amara. Growing up, she had seen her mother face it every day. Mrs. Johnson had cleaned houses for wealthy families, her back aching, her spirit weary, but her head held high. Amara remembered coming home from school one afternoon and finding her mother in tears after being told by an employer that people like her should be grateful just to be inside such a nice house. That was the day Amara decided she would never allow anyone to make her feel small. She promised herself she would rise higher, not just for her, but for her mother, her grandmother, and every other woman in her family who had carried more weight than they should have had to. And yet, here she was, a letter in hand, a stranger's venom cutting her down with one sentence. The wound wasn't just personal, it was professional. Amara had built her life around fighting for others. She was supposed to be strong, unshakable, the one who people turned to when they were denied justice. But now she felt exposed, vulnerable, like the very ground beneath her had shifted. That night, sleep never came. Instead, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every challenge she had ever faced. She thought of the first time a teacher mispronounced her name and laughed when she corrected him. She thought of the job interviews where she watched the smile fade from the interviewer's face the moment she walked in. She thought of the stares she got when she walked into upscale restaurants alone, as if her presence needed an explanation. And now, this letter was all of those moments rolled into one, written on paper, impossible to ignore. For days, she carried the letter in her bag everywhere she went. She couldn't explain why. Maybe it was because throwing it away felt like letting the person win. Or maybe it was because a part of her knew she wasn't done with it yet. When she finally told her mother about it, Mrs. Johnson's reaction was quiet. She held the letter in her hands, her lips pressed tightly together, her eyes watering but refusing to let the tears fall. "Baby," she said finally, her voice steady, "people been trying to push us out for generations. They tell us to go back, when we've been here all along. Don't let this letter break you. Let it fuel you." Amara listened, but deep inside, the wound still ached. It wasn't just about resilience. It was about the sheer exhaustion of having to be strong all the time. Why should she always be the one to turn hate into fuel? Why did the burden always fall on people like her? The turning point came a week later. She was in court, representing a young black couple who'd been denied a rental home because the landlord claimed it was already taken. But Amara had evidence that wasn't true. She stood before the judge, her voice steady, her arguments sharp, and as she fought for them, she thought about the letter in her bag, sitting silently in the bottom corner. That's when it clicked. The person who wrote that letter wanted her silent, wanted her gone. But every word she spoke in court was the opposite of that. Every sentence was proof that she belonged exactly where she was. By the time she won the case that day, she knew. The letter wasn't just an insult. It was evidence. Proof that racism wasn't hiding in the shadows. It was alive, active, and targeting people like her. And if she was going to dedicate her life to fighting injustice, then this letter would not be forgotten. It would be Exhibit A in her own fight. That night, she placed the letter in a folder labeled Case File Personal. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was the beginning of a battle that would demand every ounce of strength she had. What she didn't know yet was that this battle would grow far beyond her, that the letter would become a symbol of pain, yes, but also of power, because from this wound, a revolution in her own life was about to rise. The letter still lived inside that folder marked Case File Personal. Every time Amara opened her desk drawer, she could feel its presence, like a silent challenge staring back at her. For days she tried to push aside, focusing on her clients, burying herself in case law, attending hearings, preparing depositions. But even in the middle of her work, those words would resurface in her mind, sharp, heavy, unshakable. Go back where you came from. The more she thought about it, the less it felt like a wound and the more it felt like a dare. Whoever had written it expected her to shrink, to quit, to bow her head in shame. But why should she? Why should anyone? That thought burned in her until one night, unable to sleep, Amara sat at her kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper. She stared at it for a long time, then slowly began writing. Not legal arguments, not case notes, but feelings, memories, the exhaustion of carrying invisible weight every day, the sting of 1,000 small cuts, the looks, the whispers, the questions of belonging. And in the middle of her writing came clarity. This wasn't just her story. It was everyone's. Her mother's, her grandmother's, her clients', every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. This letter was bigger than her, and maybe, just maybe, it was the key to something greater. The next morning, Amara called one of her closest friends, Daniel, a journalist she trusted deeply. They met at a small cafe downtown, tucked into a corner booth. With trembling hands, she slid the letter across the table. Daniel read it once and again, his face tightening with each word. When he finally looked up, his voice was low but certain. "Amara, you need to share this. People need to see it. They need to know it's still happening." But Amara hesitated. Sharing the letter meant opening herself up to more attacks, more hate, more scrutiny. It meant becoming the story instead of fighting for someone else's. Was she ready for that? For days, she wrestled with a choice. At work, she was still the unshakable lawyer, winning battles in the courtroom. But at home, the letter whispered to her in the quiet hours, asking if she was strong enough to use it as a weapon. The turning point came unexpectedly, at a community meeting she attended for one of her clients. The room was filled with black families, young and old, sharing stories of housing discrimination. One woman stood and told of being denied an apartment because the landlord said he didn't want the building to change. Another spoke of her children being followed in stores. Amara listened, her chest tightening with each story, until finally she pulled the letter from her bag and held it up. "This," She said, her voice shaking but growing stronger with every word, "is what landed on my desk. A letter telling me to go back where I came from. And I want you to know you're not alone. Because if they're sending this to me, they could send it to any one of us." The room fell silent. Some people gasped, others nodded, and a few wiped tears from their eyes. In that silence, Amara realized something. The letter wasn't just hate. It was proof. Proof of what her community already knew, but the world kept ignoring. And so, the spark was lit. Over the next few weeks, Amara worked tirelessly, not just on her clients' cases, but on something new. She began collecting stories, testimonies, letters, and documents from people in her community. She filed complaints, reached out to advocacy groups, and started shaping what would become one of the most important fights of her career. A case not about one person, but about the system itself. At night, she would sit at her desk, the folder with the letter always nearby, and think about the weight of what she was doing. Fear was still there, of course. Fear of backlash, of threats, of being targeted even more. But beside the fear was something stronger, resolve. Her mother noticed it too. One evening, as Amara was preparing her notes, Mrs. Johnson came into the room and placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "You've carried that letter long enough," she said softly. "Now let it carry you. Turn it into the reason you stand taller." And Amara did. Piece by piece, she built her case, not just in the legal sense, but in the human sense. She gathered voices. She amplified stories. She turned her own pain into a bridge for others to walk across. By the time Daniel published an article about her fight, including the words of the anonymous letter, it spread like wildfire. Some reacted with outrage, others with denial, but one thing was undeniable. The conversation had begun. The letter that was supposed to silence her had instead made her voice louder. And as Amara stood before her community at the end of that month, the letter framed behind her on the wall like a reminder. She made a vow, not just to fight, but to win, because she understood now. Every hateful word, every attempt to erase her, only gave her more reason to rise. The article Daniel wrote was supposed to be a spotlight, something that shed truth into dark corners. But instead, it felt like the opening shot of a war. Within hours of publication, the story was everywhere. News outlets picked it up. Activist groups shared it. Strangers sent messages of support, telling Amara she was brave, that she was a voice for so many who didn't have one. But along with the support came the other side, the side that always shows its teeth when truth gets too close. Her inbox filled with hate. Anonymous messages dripped with venom. "Go back home. You're making this up for attention. You'll never win." Her office phone rang nonstop. Some callers offered encouragement. Others spat slurs into the receiver before hanging up. A few whispered threats, chilling in their vagueness. "Watch your back." Even inside the courthouse, she could feel the shift. Judges who once greeted her warmly now kept their tone clipped. Opposing lawyers smirked when she entered the room, as though her story had confirmed every stereotype they secretly believed. And worse, some colleagues avoided her altogether, afraid of being pulled into her fight. It was isolating. It was suffocating. But Amara refused to bend. One evening, as she prepared for a major hearing in the discrimination case she'd been building, she found herself staring at the letter pinned above her desk. That ugly note had started this storm, but it was also her anchor. She whispered to herself, "They think this will break me. They don't know who I am." And then the real battle began. Her legal opponents were ruthless. They filed motion after motion, trying to bury her case in paperwork. They questioned her credibility, suggesting her personal experiences made her biased and unfit to represent clients in housing discrimination claims. In closed chambers, one opposing lawyer even laughed and said, "Maybe you should focus on smaller cases, sweetheart. This one's too big for you." But Amara didn't shrink. Instead, she sharpened. She spent sleepless nights combing through records, gathering testimony, and preparing witnesses. She trained her clients to stand tall under questioning, reminding them their truth was stronger than any intimidation tactic. She partnered with advocacy groups, building a coalition of voices that reached beyond the courtroom and into the streets. And the streets responded. Community members began showing up outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "We belong here," and "Justice has no borders." Families who had never attended a legal proceeding before filled the benches, watching Amara argue with a passion that electrified the air. But the backlash grew louder too. A smear campaign started online, painting Amara as angry, ungrateful, and divisive. Anonymous letters, more than one now, found their way to her office. One morning, she arrived to find her office door vandalized with the words, "Go back." Her hands trembled as she cleaned the paint away, but inside, her fire only grew. One night, exhausted, she called her mother. Mrs. Johnson's voice was steady, the kind of steady Amara had leaned on since childhood. "Baby," she said softly, "when storms come, trees with shallow roots fall. But trees with deep roots? They bend, they sway, but they don't break. And you, Amara, you've got roots deeper than they'll ever know." Those words wrapped around Amara like armor. So when she walked back into court the next day, shoulders straight and eyes clear, she carried not just her own strength, but the strength of every ancestor, every neighbor, every client who believed in her. The courtroom was tense. The opposing counsel presented polished arguments, dismissing discrimination as isolated incidents, painting her clients as misunderstanding situations. They spoke in cold, clinical tones, stripping humanity from the very people Amara fought for. But when it was her turn, Amara rose slowly, placed her hands firmly on the lectern, and began to speak. Her voice carried across the room, not loud, but steady, threaded with conviction. She didn't just present evidence. She told the story. She painted the picture of doors slammed in faces, of apartments withheld, of lives uprooted by prejudice disguised as policy. She reminded the court that behind every statistic was a family, a child, a dream. For the first time, the judge leaned forward, listening. The room grew silent except for her voice. Even the opposition seemed unsettled, as if realizing the storm they had unleashed was bigger than they imagined. When Amara finished, she sat down, her chest heaving, her palms damp, but her eyes were clear. That night, outside the courthouse, a crowd gathered again. This time, they didn't just hold signs. They chanted her name. They thanked her. And in that sea of voices, Amara realized something vital. The backlash wasn't a sign she was losing. It was proof she was shaking something that needed to be shaken. Because when you challenge power, power fights back. And Amara? She was just getting started. Amara had always believed that passion could shield her from exhaustion, that if she loved justice enough, if she worked hard enough, she could carry any burden. But passion, she was learning, came with a cost. The nights blurred into each other. Files covered her dining table, spilling into stacks that looked less like papers and more like walls closing in around her. The clock ticked past midnight again and again as she typed, red-eyed, chasing deadlines and building arguments. And yet, even when she tried to rest never came. Her phone buzzed constantly, emails, calls, messages, both supportive and hateful. Some nights she turned it face down, but the shadows in her room seemed to whisper the words she had read earlier that day. "You don't belong here." The weight was suffocating. Her friendships began to fade. Invitations came less often, until they stopped altogether. Even when friends reached out, she was too drained to answer, too consumed by the fight. She told herself it was temporary, that one day she would make it up to them. But the silence grew longer, heavier. And then there was her health. She skipped meals, grabbing coffee instead of dinner, energy drinks instead of sleep. Her once regular jogs through the park became distant memories. Even her mother's voice, urging her to take care of herself, often went unanswered. But the sharpest wound came from loneliness. One evening, as she walked home after another brutal day in court, Amara passed a cafe where laughter spilled out onto the street. Inside, families sat together, couples leaned close, friends shared jokes over warm food. For a moment, she stopped at the window. She pressed her hand against the cool glass and whispered to herself, "When was the last time I laughed like that?" Her reflection stared back. Tired eyes, hollow cheeks, shoulders sagging under invisible weight. She almost didn't recognize the woman staring at her. But she didn't have time to dwell, because the fight was escalating. Opposing lawyers weren't just battling her in court. They were digging into her past, searching for weaknesses. Old school records surfaced online. Anonymous blogs twisted her story, painted her as bitter, radical, a troublemaker looking for attention. One even dredged up the fact that she had once been late on rent during law school, using it as proof she was unfit to represent clients in housing cases. The smear campaign worked its poison. She overheard whispers in the courthouse. Former allies began to keep their distance. And worst of all, some clients grew nervous, asking quietly if staying with her would hurt their chances. Amara smiled through it, assuring them she was still their strongest advocate. But inside, each doubt cut deeper than the last. Her mother noticed a change before Amara admitted it to herself. One Sunday, when Amara finally made it home for dinner, Mrs. Johnson looked at her daughter with worried eyes. "Baby," she said, softly setting down the spoon in her hand, "you're carrying the world on your shoulders, but even the strongest shoulders need rest." Amara forced a smile. "I don't have time to rest, Mama. If I stop, they win." Her mother reached across the table, her hand warm, steady. "And if you break, Amara, what then? Who will carry the torch if you burn yourself out?" The words hit harder than any insult, any smear campaign. Because deep down, Amara knew her mother was right. But knowing and acting were two different things. That night, back in her apartment, Amara opened her laptop. She stared at the blinking cursor, the screen waiting for her to prepare tomorrow's motions. But her hands didn't move. Instead, tears welled in her eyes, hot, uninvited, uncontrollable. She pressed her palms against her face, trying to silence the sobs before they broke through. For the first time since that hateful letter arrived, she allowed herself to admit the truth. She was tired, bone-deep tired. And in that exhaustion, fear crept in. What if the system was too big, too corrupt, too unmovable? What if she lost not just the case, but herself? Her chest tightened until it felt like she couldn't breathe. Panic surged. She stumbled toward the window, throwing it open, gulping at the cool night air. Below, the city buzzed, cars honking, people laughing, life moving on. A life she felt increasingly separated from. She gripped the windowsill, grounding herself, whispering, "I can't stop now. I can't stop now." But the voice inside her, quiet, scared, human, whispered back, "How much longer can you keep going?" And then a message pinged on her phone. It was from Daniel, the journalist who had written the first article about her case. His words were simple but powerful. "They're trying to silence you because your voice is shaking the walls. Don't let them win. Not now." Amara exhaled, the panic easing just enough for her to stand. She wasn't alone. Not completely. The battle was costing her everything. Her health, her peace, her relationships. But somewhere deep in her bones, she knew the greater the cost, the greater the victory would be. Still, as she finally collapsed into bed that night, one question lingered in her mind, heavy and relentless. What if winning this fight meant losing herself? The courthouse steps had never felt so heavy beneath Amara's feet. Day after day, she had climbed them with determination. But today, her legs trembled as though each step carried the weight of 1,000 voices whispering against her. The media cameras flashed in her face, not with curiosity this time, but with accusation. Headlines scrolled across their screens. Amara Johnson, advocate or agitator? She kept her head high, but inside, the cracks were widening. In the courtroom, the attacks sharpened. The opposing counsel, polished and smug, twisted every fact into a weapon. They mocked her arguments, sneered at her clients, and slipped barbed remarks designed to unravel her composure. And it worked. For the first time, Amara's voice faltered. Her notes blurred on the page as her vision swam with exhaustion. Her hands shook as she gripped the podium. She pushed through the arguments, but she could feel it. The quiet celebration in her opponent's eyes. They smelled weakness. By the end of the day, Amara collapsed onto a bench outside the courthouse, her body trembling. She pressed her hands to her face, willing the tears not to fall in public. But the dam broke. Her chest heaved, sobs racking her frame, the weight of the fight crashing down all at once. She thought about her mother's words. Even the strongest shoulders need rest. And for the first time, she admitted to herself that maybe, just maybe, She couldn't carry it anymore. She imagined walking away, dropping the case, finding another job, a quieter life. No more late nights, no more smear campaigns, no more fear every time she opened her inbox. The thought of surrender felt like betrayal, but it also felt like relief. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Amara whispered to herself, "Maybe I can't do this anymore." But fate had other plans. That evening, back at her apartment, Amara found an envelope slipped under her door. Her first thought was dread, another threat, another hateful letter. Her hands trembled as she opened it, but inside wasn't venom. It was a simple note, handwritten in careful script. "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but thank you. Because of you, my children and I still have a roof over our heads. Because of you, I believe justice is possible. Don't stop. Please don't stop." No signature, just hope pressed onto paper. Amara sank onto the floor, clutching the note to her chest. Tears streamed down her face, not despair this time, but of something far more powerful. She realized then that this fight was never just about her. It wasn't about the smear campaigns, the exhaustion, or even her reputation. It was about the countless lives tangled in the web of injustice. People who had no voice unless she spoke for them. The breaking point she thought would end her instead became a revelation. She couldn't stop, not because she was unbreakable, but because she wasn't fighting for herself alone. She picked up her phone, scrolling past the hateful messages, until she found Daniel's number. When he answered, his voice was cautious. "Amara, are you okay?" She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I almost gave up today," she admitted. "But then I realized I don't have that right. Not when so many are counting on me." There was silence on the line, then Daniel's steady reply. "Then let me help you make sure the world knows exactly why you're fighting." And just like that, the weight shifted. It didn't disappear, it never would, but it no longer pinned her down. In the days that followed, Amara returned to court with a new fire. The smear campaign still raged. The exhaustion still gnawed at her bones. But now, every hateful headline, every sneer from the opposition, only reminded her of the note she kept folded in her wallet. When the opposing counsel mocked her again, Amara didn't falter. She raised her voice, clear and unshakable. "Your clients may have power, but my clients have truth. And truth doesn't bend to wealth or intimidation." The courtroom fell silent. For the first time, she saw uncertainty flicker in her opponent's eyes. And in that moment, Amara knew she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was winning. The courthouse was silent, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Amara sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the weight of months of struggle pressing against her shoulders. Across the aisle, the opposing counsel leaned back, smug and polished, but even his confidence had cracks now. The judge shuffled papers. The jury exchanged looks. This was it. The trial that had begun with doubt, hate letters, and whispered threats was about to end. As the foreperson stood, the world seemed to narrow to a single moment. On the matter of Johnson versus Fairview Realty, the words rang out heavy with destiny. Amara closed her eyes for a brief second. She thought of the letter slipped under her door, of the mother who begged her not to stop fighting, of every client who walked into her office with nothing but hope in their eyes. We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, a cry of relief from the back, where one of her clients sat clutching her children. Amara's chest heaved as she drew in a shaky breath. The verdict wasn't just a victory, it was vindication. Proof that truth, though battered and bruised, could still stand tall against power. Her clients rushed to her, tears streaming, thanking her over and over. She hugged them tightly, her own tears finally free. For once, the cameras flashing in her direction didn't feel like weapons. They felt like witnesses to history. But the victory wasn't without scars. The smear campaigns had left their mark. Friendships had been tested, her health strained. Nights spent without sleep had carved deep lines into her face. She knew the fight wasn't over. Justice was never a finish line, only a path. And yet, standing on those courthouse steps with the crowd gathering, microphones thrust toward her, Amara realized something profound. She had transformed. She was no longer just a girl who had received a hateful letter telling her to go back where you came from. She was the woman who stood tall in the face of hate and turned that cruelty into fuel. She raised her chin and addressed the sea of cameras. "This victory is not mine alone," she said, her voice steady, amplified by every lens, every microphone. "It belongs to every person who has ever been told they don't belong. It belongs to every mother who prays her children will see a better tomorrow. And it belongs to those who believe that justice is not a privilege of the few, but a right for us all." The crowd erupted in applause, cheers echoing through the city streets. Her words didn't erase the pain, the nights of despair, the moments she had nearly broken, but they transformed them into something lasting, a movement. Weeks later, Amara received another letter. This time, it wasn't hate. It was from a young law student, a black woman who wrote, "Watching you gave me courage. I used to think I didn't belong in this field, but now I know I do. Because of you, I believe I can fight too." Amara smiled as she folded the letter, slipping it into the same drawer that still held the first hateful note. 2 letters side by side, one born of hate, one born of hope. Together, they told the story of her journey, how cruelty had tried to silence her, and how courage had answered back. On a quiet evening, Amara sat with her mother on the porch of their family home. The cicadas sang in the background, and for once, there was peace. Her mother reached over, squeezing her hand. "You've carried so much, baby girl," she said softly. "But look at what you've built. Look at how far you've come." Amara leaned against her, tears glistening in her eyes. "I almost gave up, Mama." "But you didn't," her mother whispered. "And that's why they'll remember your name." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Amara knew her journey was far from over. There would be new battles, new walls to tear down, new voices to amplify. But she no longer feared the fight, because the greatest triumph wasn't just a verdict in a courtroom. It was discovering that the very words meant to break her, "Go back where you came from," had become the spark that proved she was exactly where she was meant to be. Amara stood, watching the stars blink to life in the night sky, and with quiet conviction, she whispered to herself, "This is only the beginning."